Welcome to Feed Your Dog Facts, the internet's #1 resource for fighting pet food industry misinformation and promoting evidence-based pet care. Now, here are your hosts, Daniel Shuloff and Alexis Malone.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Feed Your Dog Facts. It is the end of July. We are almost into August. My name is Alexis Malone. I am your host. I'm alongside Daniel Shuloff. He is the founder and CEO of Keto Natural Pet Foods, also the author of Dogs, Dog Food, and Dogma. Highly recommend picking up a copy if you haven't done so already. Daniel, always a pleasure. Welcome. Happy almost August.
Thank you. Yeah, yes. Quite warm out here in Salt Lake City, Utah. St. Bernard, not St. Bernard weather.
No.
But, you take... Every time Wayne goes for a walk, you have to do it in the morning, of course, because it gets so hot so fast. But then it's like he just runs into the air conditioning and immediately plops down, actively runs to the air conditioning vent and plops down on the cold tile in front of it as soon as he gets back from the walk. So
Wayne's a St. Bernard, right?
Yeah.
If you see, I know that I have seen him featured quite a bit on Keto Naturals. Instagram and Facebook. And so I am a big Wayne follower.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Well, today we are going to be talking about synthetic vitamins and if they are unhealthy for your dog. And I'm excited to get into this topic, one, because I really know nothing about this. And so I'm excited to learn. But two, I feel like synthetic brings a negative emotional response when we say it in the context of pet food. And so I'm hoping to understand it a little bit more to see if others feel similarly as I do, or if this is just a notion that really has no foundation to it based on the data. So excited to jump into this topic. And with that, I think we'll start with just generally speaking what healthy means, right? Like when we say synthetic vitamins, are they healthy for your dog? Can you describe what is? What are we looking for?
Yeah, that is kind of the rub of the issue. So let me just do a little bit to frame it up in my words too. My experience, it is definitely an issue for a lot of pet food consumers, whether the vitamin and mineral content is from synthetic sources or organic sources. This is not really an issue of macronutritional content, carbohydrate, fat, and protein. This is really about vitamins. There are vitamins are what we call micronutrients, right? They're in food products and they're used when you consume them by your body, by your dog's body. They're nutrients, but they're in small quantities. You only need them in trace amounts. You don't need grams and grams of this stuff every day. They don't contain a significant calorie load, but they're still doing useful things in your body. If the body doesn't have them, things don't work as intended. And like you said, it is definitely the case that some pet owners believe that one of the qualities that is important for them in choosing a pet food product is whether the vitamin content is synthetic or not. You can, over the decades that nutrition generally has been studied, the food industry has come up with ways, has understood these substrates at such a small level. They figured out exactly what they are, and they can make them in a lab. You can use chemistry to make vitamin A or whatever the specific vitamin you're talking about is, and so those kinds of synthetic vitamins are pretty widely used both in human food products and in pet food ones. Most commonly think about the multivitamin that tons and tons of Americans and other people every day take their daily multivitamin. That's synthetic. For the most part, those are synthetic vitamins. It's a pill, right? That's not just organic sourcing of vitamin A from a variety of different plants that then gets distilled down to vitamin A. That's using modern kind of food engineering to make those synthetic vitamins that you then take in every day in your vitamin pill. So when you make pet food, the vitamin content can come from one of two places. It can come from synthetic vitamins where you can add a micronutrient like pack or like a multivitamin to your recipe, and or you can supply vitamins and minerals through specific food ingredients, organic materials. So it's like when you use like chicken liver in your pet food recipe, chicken liver contains some amount of some vitamins, and and of course, when you add a bunch of ingredients together, a product is going to have a micronutrient profile. It's going to have a total amount of vitamin A, C, E, etc. And so that is in contrast to synthetic vitamins. That's like an organic source of vitamin content. And so some pet foods are made with synthetic vitamins. Some are made with a combination of organic and synthetic. And some are made with like no synthetics at all. And like a good example, the example I've seen recently is a brand called Carna 4, like the number 4. It's very prominent on the top of their label, no synthetics. And it's designed to appeal to folks who view that as a attractive quality in a pet food. And the reason they view it as attractive, of course, is because they think of it as not as healthful as organic vitamins. The question becomes, well, is that something that's based on good evidence? What's the logic behind this? Is this something that holds water or not? And so let's do our little deep dive into synthetic vitamins and organic vitamins. And like you said, I think the place to start it is with like just thinking a little bit about what we mean by good health. Like, is it healthy for an animal to get its vitamins from synthetic sources or organic sources? Okay, well, to answer that question, we have to be on the same page with what healthy means. To me, the most sensible way to think about healthy nutrition is like disease avoidance. Lifespan is another way of saying, or health span are kind of ways of saying the same thing. But like what you're trying to do when you eat healthfully is you're trying to avoid bad things happening from eating. Like you're trying to avoid specific kinds of diseases. And I think that when it comes to people's thinking about synthetic vitamins, too often they're not thinking about health in that kind of specific, rigorous way. Instead, it's sort of like a health halo concept. We use like the concept of the health halo a bit on here, where it's like, well, it doesn't feel like the vibe. It's not healthy. And it's like, well, okay, well, let's just look at it in a little more detail. And let's say like, what is health here? What we're talking about is avoiding disease. Diseases, when it comes to nutrition, fall into two buckets. One is what you can kind of generally call acute deficiency diseases. This is one kind of disease that you can get as a result of nutrition, as a result of what you eat. Some examples that people will be familiar with of deficiency diseases are anemia. That's what happens when you don't eat enough iron. Osteopenia. This is like what happens when you don't eat enough calcium. It's a bone deficiency problem that you'll develop if you don't take in enough calcium. Or sarcopenia is like muscle wasting that happens as you get older and generally is caused by you're not eating enough protein to keep building up the muscle that you need. But like generally speaking, those are the types of like, what I'm trying to stress there are kind of two qualities. One, it's like an acute thing. It's like, another example is like scurvy. I don't know if dogs get scurvy or not, but that's like a disease that when I was a kid, your mother would tell you, like, you got to make sure you eat your fruits because you need vitamin C or else you're going to get scurvy. It's this old timey disease that like sailors used to get because they'd be on boats for like 3 months at a time, like these old timey sailors, and they wouldn't eat fresh fruits and they wouldn't get enough vitamin C and they get this disease scurvy that's really bad. And so that's like another type of thing. But it's like you don't take in enough of something, you get sick in a very specific kind of acute way if you miss some specific nutrient, right?
I feel like this is common for, like you hear a lot of iron deficiency in...
Relatively. It's one of the most common ones for sure.
Right.
What? Yeah, what?
I was also going to say that I checked the internet, and according to the internet, so, I put as much weight as you want into this answer, but dogs don't typically get scurvy. So
okay, fair enough. But there are all number of deficiency diseases that dogs really do get. Like this is why people say that certain vitamins are essential for a dog. or essential for a person. If you don't take in the essential amount, you're likely to get one of these deficiency diseases. That's like what that means. The contrast with an acute deficiency disease is like a long-term chronic disease. And nutrition, we know, can impact that stuff too. Those are conditions like obesity, diabetes, arthritis, even cancer. These are things that if day after day you eat too much of something, you eat the wrong things, your body's going to change in ways that are going to make it more likely to develop one of these diseases over the long term. You're having essentially, again, two kind of primary qualities. One is in acute deficiency diseases, like you're not getting enough of something you need. And in most cases of like chronic, nutritionally linked chronic diseases, you're getting too much of something. You're having like, diabetes is exacerbated by like, you're allergic to carbs. You're getting too much carbs in the diet. Your body can't process all that glucose, too much of something. And generally speaking, the chronic disease problems that we're talking about, obesity, cancer, diabetes, et cetera, are all diseases that are nutritionally linked in that sense. You're getting too much of something, not enough of something. When it comes to the difference between acute deficiency diseases and long-term chronic diseases, the difference between like not getting enough versus getting too much of is just one of a couple things that are also really important to note. The other one that's really important to note is that it is well accepted in this day and age that the primary problems, like from a public health perspective, companion animal public health perspective, the problems we're dealing with as a culture that are really common are the chronic diseases, okay? Half of the dogs in the country have obesity. This is a disease that is linked to lifespan. They'll shorten your dog's life on average by years, and half the dogs in the country suffer from it, okay? Millions of dogs and cats, diabetes. Millions of dogs, cancer, okay? When it comes to acute deficiency diseases, not so common. There's nothing that is even remotely like something like obesity where half of the dogs in the country suffer from it.
And can you just pause right there and explain a little bit as to why? Like, I assume that if your pet food, is on the shelf, it has to meet certain requirements,
That's
which
exactly right.
That you are already getting. So really, when it comes down to who needs to be worried about what vitamins they're getting organically, or even if you use, like, I know that there's synthetic vitamin packs that you can add to homemade dog food as well. That's the group of people who need to be probably the most concerned, more so than those who are picking up their dog foods off the shelf, correct?
Well, what I mean is like that, what you're highlighting, that like if you're selling dog food in a store in the United States, you by law are required to make sure in a variety of ways that it contains certain like nutritional content in a way that's going to avoid those deficiency diseases. That's why they're so rare. So that was like the second point that I was going to make is like, these diseases are rare. It is not common that dogs get a thing where it's like, oh, they haven't eaten enough vitamin E and now they're getting a disease as a deficiency disease. That's not common. What is common is obesity, cancer, osteoarthritis, these chronic diseases of excess.
Too much,
deficiency stuff. The second important thing is why that is the case is because the vast majority of Americans feed commercial pet food, and commercial pet food is required by law to contain the certain kind of vitamin and nutrient content that is going to avoid those deficiency diseases. There are multiple groups, the National Research Council, which is a part of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences, and this private industry group called the Association of American Feed Control Officials, AFCO. Every year, but that's not true. In the case of AFCO, it's every year. In the case of the NRC, it's every few years. They sit down with the literature as it exists and pore over any new studies and figure out, do we need to update our required nutrient profiles? Do we need to say, is there new evidence that says, well, this is too much or too little copper for a dog. This is how much calcium a dog needs to take in. We got this new piece of evidence. And then they update that profile that every commercial pet food needs to meet in order to be sold. And that's kind of like, that does a reasonably good job of making sure that people are feeding their dogs the right amount of vitamins to avoid those things. and does a good enough job that it's uncommon. Where you see it is exactly what you've highlighted, is when people try to make stuff at home for their dog, it's easier to goof that up and do something like, if you feed only chicken breast to your dog, excellent macronutrient profile in a lot of, in some ways at least, but like you're going to end up with some deficiency disease if that's all you feed the dog. It's not going to get enough, specific kinds of lipids, for instance, but like all kinds of things. And then that's like the inadvertent, it's kind of difficult and like complicated to make sure that you get the balance exactly right. Okay. So that's the first like notion. Okay. So we're thinking about health. We're thinking about disease avoidance. We're thinking about good, healthy nutrition, thinking about disease avoidance. That's point one. Point two is what that means is two things, either acute deficiency diseases or long-term chronic disease risk. Okay. And each of those has its own qualities. Acute deficiency diseases, you're not eating enough of something and you're going to get one of these rare, but very serious diseases. Chronic disease, you're eating too much of something and it's going to be one of these just as severe, but much more common diseases. So when you go to figure out what's a healthy choice for my dog, what you're essentially saying is I'm trying to minimize those two things, right? You want to try to reduce like both chronic disease risk and acute deficiency disease risk. So becomes like, all right, is the synthetic versus natural vitamins issue pertinent to either of those things? Well, what I'll submit to you is that it's only pertinent to one of them. It's pertinent to the acute deficiency disease side. Chronic diseases, like the argument, when you hear it made by folks who are proponents of not feeding synthetic vitamins, they're saying synthetic vitamins are not healthy for your dog. The argument goes that if they're in a synthetic state, the dog doesn't absorb them as well as if they're in a natural state. They're less bioavailable. They can't be digested as well as in a natural state. Or they can be digested, but they aren't absorbed as well as if they're in a natural state. Synthetic vitamins are chemically identical to natural vitamins. Like that's what it means to be a synthetic vitamin. It is the constituent parts down at the atomic level, at the molecular level, those things are the same. What's different though is the context in which they are found. Like a molecule of vitamin A in a leaf of spinach is not the same as a molecule of vitamin A in a vitamin pill because the context around it is different. It's different amounts of moisture. There's different, they interact, the vitamins and minerals interact with each other. It's present in different quantities. And to some degree, there's evidence that that context matters with how much you absorb or metabolize these nutrients. And so the argument goes, well, synthetics aren't absorbed as well. And so if you do synthetic instead of natural, you're not going to get as much of the vitamins as you need. That's an acute deficiency disease problem, right? That's not a chronic disease thing where the problem is you're getting too much of something, not enough of it, getting too much. Like it's not if somebody says well, you're getting too much of it, and you're like, well, yeah, but I don't want to feed synthetic versions anymore because my dog's not going to absorb enough. I want it to absorb even more of the thing it's getting too much of. That obviously doesn't make any sense. What it makes sense about is acute problems where it's like, my dog, if he eats synthetics, is not going to get enough of the vitamins he needs. Therefore, he might get an acute deficiency disease. So the first thing to recognize about that is what you're saying is you're more worried about these very rare things than you are about the much more pertinent, in my judgment, issues, these long-term chronic problems that tons and tons of dogs every year are getting. If it is the case that that natural vitamins aren't as well as synthetic, other way around, are absorbed more easily than synthetics. The problem is you might get, if the theory holds water, you might get an acute deficiency disease. But it's not at a thing that you're going to get chronic disease, too much more chronic disease. That's nobody is making that claim. So we're focusing in entirely on the acute side. And that's sort of the place to start is to recognize that if you're making a claim that you think that synthetics aren't healthy, what you're saying is, I don't want to feed synthetics because I'm too worried that if I do, my dog's going to get a deficiency disease. And so my response to that is always it is at least theoretically possible. That's not a thing. context does matter to some degree. But what I would say is like, I mean, a few things. One is that like AFCO and the NRC, like they account for bioavailability. When they set up these nutrient profiles, when they say like, all right, your dog needs this much calcium every day, it's not, they don't just do it in a vacuum. They don't assume that everything the animal takes in is getting absorbed exactly 100%. They do it with assumptions about what is typical for how much the animal consumes. And so all that stuff that like, well, what rate, it's all baked in there. The other is, I would submit to you that like, if this was actually a problem, we would see it as a societal problem. We'd see big, like the vast majority of pet foods are based heavily on synthetics, and dogs are not getting deficiency diseases at any kind of significant way. Like the times when that happens is like, here's like the case where it could happen. It's like, let's say you make a pet food and your nutrient profile just barely clears AFCO's standard, right? Like for, again, let's say calcium. You're like just 0.01% above AFCO's calcium standard, but you use all synthetics. And as a result, let's say they're less bioavailable that way. They're absorbed less well that way. Well, it might be the case that takes your food under that threshold, and now the dog's not getting enough of it and it's going to get deficiency disease.
My counter argument to that though would be, I can't imagine that the line is that thin, you know? Like I can't imagine that there is no buffer room when AFCO is setting these standards.
Yeah, and so that is right. That's sort of what I'm saying about like they're baking bioavailability assumptions into it. Like they're saying if the dog really needs to absorb 1,000 this is not an actual number, just an example, 1,000 milligrams of vitamin Z every day. They don't just say that the food has to contain 1,000 milligrams of vitamin Z. They put a buffer into it because they assume that not all of it is going to get absorbed and is going to be bioavailable. And it changes, vitamin to vitamin, depending on what the evidence says about how easily these things are absorbed. But there's actually a second issue involved, which is that like, regardless of what AFCO requires, like this only comes into play if your specific brand is like just barely clearing AFCO's standard. You know what I mean? Like nobody's making the case that synthetics are unabsorbable. They don't work. Like if that was the case, okay, we'd be seeing all these deficiency diseases. It would clearly be a thing. It has to be the case that like if your brand is just like when we think about vitamins at Keto Natural, it's like, unless it's a vitamin where there is a safe upper limit, like some of these things, it can become toxic when you have too much of it.
Sure.
Some of them, no, they get secreted. If you don't absorb it, it just passes through the animal and gets secreted and no problem. It makes sense to engineer in a way that you meet the threshold by a good bit. Like most brands are not just like, well, we're going to make sure, for cost reasons or for something, so we barely clear that threshold. Like that's not a real economic contributor to like the making these products. So the vast majority of folks that make pet food go way, like to the extent that they can, because it's allowed, it's, the safe upper limited and so on, they go like well above it. And so for the like synthetic issue to even theoretically come into play, number one, it's got to be something where really it's much less bioavailable. And number two, the brand has to barely be clearing the threshold at baseline. And it's like, just not, clearly is not something that's happening at any significant degree, because most brands do use synthetics and very few dogs get deficiency disease problems. So that's like a little bit of just kind of into the weeds of how the thinking ought to go, in my judgment, around like, well, should I weight this issue as an important one when I'm thinking about, we talk about in the show a lot, right? Like making a decision about what to feed your dog is a balancing of a lot of factors. Like people want it to be like there is one brand that is best for everything or one strategy that's best for everything. And it's just not the case. The cheapest product is not going to be the product that is most healthful. The most healthful product might not be the most sustainable product. Like you have value judgments that you're going to balance in there. But if what your concern is that like, I'm very concerned with health and I'm very concerned, if I'm very concerned with health, the synthetics issue should not be, in my judgment, nearly as important as like macronutrient content, which has clear impacts on the big chronic disease problems that we see all the time. And so I guess that's sort of like, just to make sure that we hit this point well, is like, there is definitely no compelling evidence that the kinds of chronic disease problems that dogs experience, cancer, obesity, diabetes, arthritis, are caused by not getting enough of some, micronutrient. There's no link that's ever been established between cancer and some long-term chronic disease. There's developmental things calcium and some chronic disease. Developmental things, acute deficiency diseases, absolutely. And so again, it's like you're prioritizing. Am I prioritizing? I'm going to make sure, I don't care about the chronic disease things. I'm just going to make sure that my dog doesn't get an acute deficiency disease. I'm going to be conservative in my decision-making about that. I don't think that's a very logical way to think about it. You know what I mean? Like I don't have the carnivore label in front of me right now, so I can't tell you what its macronutrient makeup is, but like it's synthetic. If it's synthetic free, but it's high in carbohydrate content, you are putting the cart before the horse. You are like worrying too much, in my judgment, about something that is a nothing burger when there's a huge, real problem that you can deal with. That's right there, and you're mixing out, you're deprioritizing in the wrong way.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add is that I feel like you missed the third bucket of people who are, when you're considering this matter, it's the bucket that I unfortunately fall into, which is just synthetic. Obviously implies that something is man-made. And in today's marketing, that is not something you want. You want the organic, you want, all of the slogans that you've been conditioned to. And so for me, that's honestly like I didn't even think about these other two issues. So thank you for shedding light.
No. You're exactly right. I mean, like that is, to me at least, like that's kind of what I'm signing up to do. Like my dog can't make good nutrition decisions on his own, unfortunately. Like he cannot read, he cannot use the benefit of, decades of scientific knowledge contained in a textbook to his benefit. Like he can't do that. I can to some degree, and so I'm in charge of that for him. He's relying on me to make good decisions about that. And what that means, in part, is I'm going to think about these things in some degree of detail. I'm not just going to go, the vibes are right around this, therefore I'm doing it. Like you got to do a little more than that for them, because like it's just really easy to get misled and to not think clearly just if you're going on the vibes. Like it's just real easy for folks to kind of pull the wool over your eyes. And it's done all the time, every day in the culture that we live in, where it's just like natural equals good, man-made equals bad. Therefore, don't do something that's not natural. And so that is what I think it kind of boils down to. But hopefully for anybody who thinks about this issue and is sort of like trying to add some kind of like a structure to how they're thinking about it, maybe this sort of presentation helps a little bit with that.
Yeah, I think the takeaway, which again, we can ask the audience, is just what do you think when you hear the word healthy and what does it mean for your dog to be healthy? And I think where my brain goes is I want to, if I'm thinking in terms of my own health, I want to live long and feel good. And I personally can't say that if I take synthetic vitamins, if I feel better or worse as a result. Now, I don't have any deficiencies, so I'll state that.
But you would if you know what I mean? Like if you,
sure.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I also, my dog's blood work has come back and she does not have any deficiencies either. And so I don't know if the difference between synthetic vitamins versus, non-man-made makes a difference for her at all. And unfortunately, we don't know. We can't ask them. So we just have to make the best decisions that we see fit. So yeah, I think if this is an issue that you are able to be thinking about down to the weeds and you have found a food that is extremely low in carbohydrate content and meets all the other requirements, then good for you, because that means that hopefully your dog does not end up with a lot of the chronic disease that we see plaguing our country currently.
Yep.
Anything else to add before we wrap up?
Not really. If anyone's still with us after that, I applaud them. It's like, oh, we're going into some
I like big mutts and I cannot lie mug probably kept everyone entertained throughout the whole thing.
Nice. That's really good. Totally it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dan. Such a pleasure to talk with you. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, reach out to us, Feed Your Dog Facts. You can find us through our website or info@feedyourdogfacts.com. See you guys later.
Bye.